As we get started today, we have a couple of things to finish from the 2nd century. I want to remind you that the first reflective essay is due a week from tomorrow, so September 4th. The reflective essay is posted on a blackboard. I have a sample one there, but certainly if you have any questions about what I'm looking for, feel free to get in contact with me. The first essay is on Justin Martyr's apology, just a few paragraphs out of that, not the entire thing. So make sure to just focus on the paragraphs listed on Blackboard. You'll be turning that in electronically, either through the link on Blackboard or by emailing it to me. But that's a week from tomorrow, so don't forget that. Don't let that slip by. As we finished up on Tuesday, we were in the context of talking about practice in the 2nd century and thinking about some of the things that Christians were involved in, but specifically thinking continuity and change. We noted at that time of the minimal information we have from non-Christian sources, talking about Christian worship, as well as some of the things addressed by early Christians, as far as what kind of things were done on the first day of the week. And we finished up talking about baptism and noted that immersion was still a primary way for baptism, but by the 2nd century there were allowances to be made for other types of modes of putting water on someone, usually in very extreme cases. And so you'll see some 2nd century writings that talk about somebody that is very, very sick. It might have water poured on them while in their bed. But for the most part, immersion was the continual mode of baptism. We also talked about how Christians in the 2nd century, we'll see this even into the 3rd century, began to theorize and discuss what about sin after baptism. Baptism takes care of your past sins, but what does it do with relationship to future sins? With some people suggesting that forgiveness after baptism might not be possible. Now again, we noted that that's kind of contrary to some of Peter's comments in the book of Acts, chapter 8, related to Simon the sorcerer. But this is one of the things that Christians debated or at least thought about. Another question was the issue of what type of water should someone be baptized in. There are some sources that said that there was the need for living water for baptism to take place. And by living water here, we're talking about not the living water that Jesus is talking about, but instead running water. Right? So the phrase living water used by these Christians refers to running water. So being baptized specifically in a stream or a river, or maybe even a lake if it's fed by a river. But you don't see too many baptistries like what we have today, places that are meant to hold water for that purpose, even though those types of structures were used in Judaism and were part of a lot of synagogues, predominantly for people who converted or for other types of ritual washing. It seems like some early Christians suggested it needed to be, you don't want to have this container of water to use for baptism. It should be some sort of a continual motion. Another change that we begin to see with respect to baptism was the distance between someone deciding they should be baptized and the actual baptism taking place. In many cases, this was in somewhat of a response to the heresies that were developing in the 2nd century. The concern was that the candidate for baptism should be thoroughly educated in the truth and completely understand what they were going into in order to be baptized. And so you hear this, or you see this phrase being used by 2nd century Christians about the catechumen, the person who is a candidate for baptism, undergoing catechetical instruction, or they're going through some sort of teaching period before actually being baptized. Quite different than what we see, for example, in the book of Acts, where people decide they need to respond to the gospel and they are baptized shortly after, right? You think of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, where they're going along and he says, "Here's water, what hinders me from being baptized?" You think of the Philippian jailer who's instructed in Acts 16, and he's baptized that same evening. But the concerns about heresy kind of drove some Christians into this process of teaching before baptism, extended teaching before baptism was to take place. I mean, I think we'd all agree, yes, you have to have some teaching. You have to know who Jesus is. You have to understand that you're a sinner, right? But this idea of a prolonged period was something new in the 2nd century. Another thing that we have related to baptism that is unclear is whether or not infant baptism was being practiced by the 2nd century. Now, certainly there are some people and some religious groups that would suggest that the household baptisms of Acts included infants. But there's nothing within the text of Acts that would require that interpretation. Household doesn't necessarily include infants. All right? But by the 2nd century, there's some indication, though it's very, very faint and it's not extremely clear, that infant baptism is starting to be practiced. By the 3rd century, however, it's much more widespread. Because for many people, for many Christians, there is still that emphasis on the need for confession and belief before baptism. Well, infants, of course, cannot express confession. They cannot technically believe. And so, a lot of Christians were still maintaining that. But by the 3rd century, we'll see, there's some changes going on based on infant mortality rates, based on concerns about salvation, that will lead to a greater increase of the practice of infant baptism. Another aspect of Christian practice developing in the 2nd century is what's often referred to as the liturgy. Liturgy refers to an order of worship, and that's probably a term, especially in the churches of Christ, that you'll hear more often, order of worship. Now, eventually, the liturgy within Christianity, certain forms of Christianity, will form into this very strict order of worship of this song is sung at this time, there's a processional at this time, these prayers are said at this time, right? Very, very specific. Doesn't seem to have been that case in the 2nd century, but there does seem to be more of a codifying of what gets done when. Some early Christian literature of this time provides examples of prayer. What do you say in prayer? But it's examples. It's not the case where you have to say this prayer in this way. Because when you think about it, we have instructions in the New Testament to pray. We have relatively few examples from Jesus of the things Jesus prayed, and relatively few prayers in the book of Acts or in other New Testament literature. And so you can understand how Christians would have said, all right, we need to pray, especially in a public setting, so what do you say? And what kind of things do I pray about, especially as you're bringing people in, new converts? And so eventually you see this literature developing on, these are the kind of things you should say in a prayer. With respect to this Eucharist, right, we talked about how the Lord's Supper eventually is referred to as the Eucharist, from the Greek word to give thanks. One of the questions that will eventually develop, that we'll talk about, is what the words, "this is my body," mean, and what the presence of the Lord's Supper, the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper means. There's a lot of debate about that. And it's the words that are used by early Christians about the Lord's Supper, these second century Christians, that are often taken in the 8th century, 9th century, and on to say, here, these early Christians believed that Jesus was actually present in the bread and the wine. So, for example, in his apology, his first apology, Justin says that the bread and the wine are no longer common food. And so later people will say, what he's talking about here is the transformation of the bread into the body of Christ, the wine into the blood of Christ, the actual body and blood. Well, maybe Justin has that idea, but probably not. Instead, what he's saying is, when this bread and this wine is brought into the service, it's not just about it being bread and wine. It's not just for nourishment. It's about, Jesus' blood in a metaphorical way. But these words will later be used by others to say that the position of Christianity and what Jesus taught, as practiced by those early Christians, was the transformation of the bread and the wine during the practice of communion or the Eucharist. A last aspect of practice has to do with church organization, particularly the rise of what we might call the monarchical bishopric, as a phrase for you. It appears by the 2nd century there are conflicting accounts of church organization. When you read through Acts, you see Paul establishing elders in the churches that he establishes, suggesting, I think quite rightly, that the New Testament talks about a plurality of leaders. But, and you still see that in some of the 2nd century Christian writings that exist, but other Christians and other Christian authors by the 2nd century talked about the organization of a congregation, a church, under one leader, the bishop. We mentioned Ignatius, and you've read about him in Gonzales. He's one of the ones who writes about the need to submit to the bishop, singular. And so this idea of there's one person that is in charge of the oversight of the church. Despite there being this bishopric developing, where there is this one leader, the bishop, that is over these congregations, largely congregations, churches, are still relatively autonomous. There isn't much structure outside of that. You don't see, like what will gradually develop within Eastern Orthodoxy, within Catholicism, of this series of levels. So the priests, the bishops, the archbishops, the pope. Right? We're talking about a situation where congregations are still kind of ruled by themselves. So, how did this develop? How did it develop where there is, if there's a plurality of leaders in the New Testament, how did it develop into a situation where there is one person over the congregation? No clear indication of how that takes place. Some scholars have suggested that it was more of a pragmatic type of development. Things like if you're giving a report or have to send a messenger to another church, right, you're going to pick one person. And so maybe that pragmatic concern of, how do we get some things done, eventually evolved into there's just one person over the leadership. Might possibly have been, right, in a group of elders, the oldest elder would have been given a lot of respect because of his age, and that gradually morphed into the bishopric. But still, like I said, autonomy. Now, we do have indications of Christians writing to other churches to kind of say, what's going on here is heretical, or you need to shape up, or keep your people in line, those kind of things. But there's no hierarchical structure or system to make sure that these guidelines are obeyed. It's the gradual development of heresy that will further that kind of institutionalization. I talked to him Tuesday about how I wanted to take some time to kind of assess second century Christianity and evaluate it and have us discuss. I still want to do that, but I want to go ahead and put that at the end of the third century discussion, and then we'll kind of take these two together. If that's okay, we'll move that direction. But before we leave the second century, I want to pause here and ask if there are questions or places where I need to make some clarifications.